I'll never forget my time as a night nurse at St. Clair's Hospital. I've worked nights for years, but the things I experienced in Ward B were something else entirely. Let me warn you, if you scare easily, turn back now. This was the graveyard shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Not many people were in the hospital that late. Just the patients and a skeleton crew of nurses and doctors on standby. St. Clair's was already notorious for strange happenings, but I hadn't experienced anything unusual myself. At least, not until that night. It all started with room 213. Ward B was already a strange place to work. Most nurses tried to avoid it if they could, saying it gave them the creeps. Some patients refused to stay in there, insisting they'd heard whispers or felt icy fingers brushing against them in the dark. That night, the charge nurse told me to cover Ward B because the usual nurse called in sick. With a sigh, I grabbed my clipboard and headed down the dim, echoing hallway. I could almost hear the air thickening around me as I approached the doors to Ward B. The feeling hit me like a slap in the face. Something was wrong. I passed a few quiet rooms until I reached 213. The patient was a middle-aged man named Mr. Ellis, recovering from a nasty accident. I knocked softly, and he mumbled for me to come in. He looked exhausted, eyes sunken and hollow. His hands shook as he grasped the thin blanket covering him. "Please," he whispered, barely meeting my eyes. "Is anyone else here?" I glanced around the room. "It's just me, Mr. Ellis. What's the matter?" He looked toward the empty corner of the room, his face going pale. He was here again, watching me. Every night since I got here, he watches me from that corner. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to remain professional. "Mr. Ellis, there's no one else here. Maybe the medication." "Don't patronize me," he hissed, a sudden burst of fear in his voice. "I know what I saw. He stands there in the shadows with that grin." His voice wavered and his eyes filled with terror. "He tells me things I don't want to hear." I did my best to calm him down, gave him some medication and told him to get some rest. But his words stuck with me. "He stands there in the shadows with that grin." Leaving his room, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was watching me too. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see a figure lurking in the shadows. The corridor lights flickered, and the quiet hum of machinery in the background seemed louder than ever. Hours dragged by, and around 3 a.m., the nurse call button for room 213 went off. I hurried to the room, but when I opened the door, Mr. Ellis was gone. The bed was empty, sheets neatly tucked in place. My heart skipped a beat. Had he wandered off? There was no way he could have left without anyone noticing. I searched the ward, checking every room, every corner, even asking the few night staff if they'd seen him. No one had. I was about to alert security when the lights in the corridor flickered again, and I heard it. A faint whisper like a distant, raspy voice calling my name. "Sarah." My heart pounded as I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway and the faint smell of antiseptic. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I was overtired, but the whisper came again, louder this time. "Sarah, he's here." The voice seemed to drift from the direction of room 213. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I found myself walking toward it, my steps slow and hesitant. When I reached the door, it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and froze. There, standing in the corner where Mr. Ellis had pointed earlier, was a figure. He wore a hospital gown, his face shadowed. But his eyes, they glowed faintly, and he had that grin. A wide, twisted grin that looked impossibly painful, as though it had been carved into his face. "Mr. Ellis," I whispered, though deep down I knew it wasn't him. The figure tilted its head, the grin widening, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in his gaze. Then he took a step forward, his bare feet dragging across the floor, making a sound like nails scratching on metal. "Sarah." His voice was a whisper, but it filled the room. I told him, and now I'm telling you. Leave. A piercing cold gripped me and I backed up, nearly tripping over my own feet. Somehow I found the strength to turn and ran down the hall. I didn't stop until I was back in the nurse's station, panting and wide-eyed. "What happened?" one of the other nurses asked, but I couldn't even answer. I just sank into a chair, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. The rest of my shift passed in a daze. By the time my replacement arrived, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination. I clocked out and went home, but I couldn't shake the image of that twisted grin. The next night, I learned that Mr. Ellis had been found. They told me he'd wandered down to the basement, of all places, and had died of a heart attack. Security found him collapsed in an old, unused surgery room, a look of horror frozen on his face. After that, I refused to work in Ward B. I asked for a transfer and never set foot in St. Clair's again. But sometimes late at night, I still hear that whisper. Sarah. They say hospitals are full of spirits, lingering souls who couldn't find peace. I don't know if that's true, but I do know this. Some patients leave more than memories behind. They leave pieces of themselves, fragments of fear and pain that cling to the walls, waiting, watching for the next soul to join them.
Story number 2.
The hospital corridors stretched on like veins in a decaying body, silent and still, save for the occasional hum of machines and flickering lights. I didn't want this shift. Graveyard hours at St. Mary's felt like a sentence, not a job. But rent didn't pay itself, so I grabbed my coffee and pulled on my scrubs, heading into what would be the longest night of my life. It started off normal enough, routine rounds, checking monitors, adjusting IVs, listening to distant snores and restless shifting. But then around 2:30 a.m., the uneasy feeling crept in. I was charting at the nurse's station when I felt a chill, the kind that raises the hair on the back of your neck. It was just cold, I told myself, shifting in my seat. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I brushed it off as best I could, but then there was a noise. Soft, almost like crying. I looked down the hall toward the source, a darkened wing of the hospital that had been closed off for renovations for months. The sound got louder. A child's cry, plaintive and echoing, filling the otherwise silent floor. I froze. No kids should be here, especially not in the closed-off wing. Against my better judgment, I stood up and headed toward the sound. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I kept walking, drawn forward one step after another. The hallway was longer than I remembered, stretching out before me like a tunnel into darkness. My footsteps echoed, growing louder, more pronounced until suddenly they didn't sound like mine. I heard another pair of footsteps, just behind me. I stopped, held my breath, and glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. But the moment I turned back, I caught a glimpse, a shadow, darting out of sight just around the corner. My heart skipped a beat. Hello? I called out, voice shaking. No response, just the lingering echo of my own voice bouncing back. I forced myself forward, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light, the night playing on my nerves. The shadow could have been anything, maybe another nurse, maybe a stray reflection. But then I saw her. She was small, standing halfway down the hallway, her back turned to me, dark hair hanging limp over her shoulders. She was wearing a hospital gown, the kind we put on all the patients, except this one looked old, tattered and smeared with something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Hey, are you okay? I took a step toward her. She didn't respond, didn't turn around, just stood there, silent and unmoving. Every fiber of my being wanted to turn and run. But I was a nurse. I couldn't just leave a patient, especially not one as vulnerable as a child. So I took another step. Then slowly she turned. Her eyes met mine. Hollow, black pits, empty and endless. Her mouth stretched into a twisted, unnatural smile. My breath caught, and a chill spread through my veins. She took a step toward me, moving too fast, too fluidly, like she was gliding rather than walking. I stumbled back, heart pounding. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, my feet glued to the floor. I managed to break free of her gaze just long enough to turn, and then I ran. My footsteps echoed down the hall, drowning out the ragged sound of my own breathing. But no matter how fast I moved, I could hear her behind me, gliding closer and closer, her footsteps steady, relentless. I reached the nurse's station, practically crashing into the desk as I scrambled for the phone. My hands were shaking, fumbling over the numbers. Just as I dialed, the line went dead, the screen going blank. Please, please, I whispered, gripping the phone tight, but the static on the other end was my only answer. My eyes darted to the monitor screens, which suddenly flickered, all showing the same feed, the hallway I'd just run from. On the screen, I saw her again, standing in the middle of the hall, staring directly at the camera as if she could see me. She tilted her head, that eerie smile stretching wider, and then, with unnatural speed, she moved closer to the camera until her face filled the entire screen. Her mouth opened, and I swear I heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Come back. The monitors went black. For a moment, everything was silent, but then the lights in the hall began flickering again. One by one, the bulbs shattered, leaving me in almost total darkness. I clutched the phone, praying for it to start working again, praying for someone to walk by, for some sign that I wasn't alone. But instead, the silence grew heavier, the air thicker as if something were pressing down on me. And then, behind me, I felt it. A cold breath against my neck. I spun around, but no one was there. But I knew she was close. I could feel her, smell the faint, sickly scent of decay, and then I heard it again. The soft, childlike sobbing, this time right in my ear. I bolted, racing down the hallway, no longer caring where I was going as long as it was away. My vision blurred, my lungs burned, but I kept going until I found myself outside the old wing, back in the familiar, brightly lit corridors of the active ward. I stumbled to the nurse's station where one of my coworkers, Jenny, was just coming back from a coffee break. She took one look at me, and her face fell. "What happened to you?" she asked, concern clear in her eyes. I tried to tell her, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I glanced back down the hallway. It was empty, just a darkened corridor stretching into nothingness. Jenny followed my gaze, then looked back at me with a strange expression. "You didn't go down there, did you?" I nodded, my heart still racing. Her face paled. "No one goes down there. Not since the accident." "What accident?" I managed to whisper, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. She hesitated, then said, "Years ago, a little girl died down there. They say she got lost in the renovations, wandered around until no one found her until it was too late." I felt my blood run cold. Jenny's eyes softened. "I'm sure it's just a story they tell to scare the new staff," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "But I'd stay out of there if I were you." I nodded, but as I glanced back down the hallway one last time, I could have sworn I saw her, standing just at the edge of the shadows, watching me, waiting. And I knew deep down that if I ever ventured back into that wing, I might not make it out. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It started with the smell. The call came in around 2 a.m., right in the middle of my night shift. I was the only nurse covering the quiet wing of Morton Regional Hospital that night. For the most part, it was just routine checks and quiet rooms, save for one new patient we'd taken in the previous evening. He was in room 409. The smell hit me as soon as I turned the corner to his room. It was a foul, stale stench, like moldy earth and something rotting. I thought maybe the patient had an infected wound or had soiled himself, so I mentally prepared for what I'd find. But when I walked into room 409, there was no one there. The bed was made, sheets pulled tight, untouched. The room was dimly lit, and everything was as it should be, except for that smell. It lingered in the air, thick and nauseating, making my stomach turn. I backed out of the room, deciding I'd ask the charge nurse if she'd moved the patient or if there was some mistake in the records. I reached the nurse's station and checked the log. Mr. Raymond Arnold, admitted around 8 p.m. for an unknown illness, but when I tried to look up his records, they were gone, as if they'd been deleted. Strange. A chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off and went to see the charge nurse, Susan, who was making her rounds in another wing. When I mentioned the missing records, she looked at me like I was insane. "Room 409? She asked, her voice hushed. "There hasn't been a patient in that room for weeks." I stared at her, confused. "No, I saw it. It's logged in too. Mr. Raymond Arnold." Susan shook her head. 409 was closed down after the last incident. She lowered her voice even more. "They call it the death room." The words hung heavy in the air, but she wouldn't say any more. I didn't believe her, or maybe I just didn't want to. But her words rattled in my head as I walked back down the hall, the shadows seeming to stretch further, deeper. When I reached room 409 again, the smell had dissipated, but I could feel something else, an intense coldness pressing down, as if the very air was freezing around me. I decided not to go back inside. Later, I tried to look up any old records of the death room, but there was nothing in the system. Whatever stories Susan knew, the official records had been wiped clean. I finished my shift and went home, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching me all night. I barely slept, and when I finally did, I dreamt of that room, a dark, twisted space that felt alive. The following night, I found myself on the same shift. I tried to avoid the wing entirely, but around midnight, the call bell from room 409 went off. I froze, staring at the blinking light, wondering if I'd imagined it. But then it rang again, the beeping echoing down the empty hall. I steeled myself and walked slowly toward the room, dread pooling in my stomach. The light above 409's door blinked steadily, casting a sickly red glow across the hall. I reached for the doorknob, heart pounding, but something held me back, like an invisible hand pushing me away. The smell hit me again, stronger this time, that awful, putrid stench of decay. Against every instinct, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, but the dim emergency lights cast strange shadows across the bed. And there, lying in it, was a man. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his sunken eyes staring straight at the ceiling. I stepped closer, my feet feeling like lead, and looked down at his face. It was Mr. Raymond Arnold. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. He shouldn't have been there. He wasn't supposed to be there. And yet, he was staring at me, his mouth open in a silent scream. I turned and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. I ran straight to the nurse's station, breathless and trembling. Susan was there, her face drawn and pale. "He's in there," I stammered. "Mr. Arnold, he's in room 409. Susan's face went white. She shook her head slowly. "He died, Emily," she whispered. "Mr. Arnold passed away over 10 years ago in room 409. My skin went cold, and I felt like I'd been plunged into ice water. But I saw him. He's there." Susan's expression hardened. "They all are," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone who's ever died in that room stays. That's why we closed it down. But they don't stay silent, not at night." I was too shaken to argue. I called out sick the next night and the night after that. But even now, I can't get the image of his face out of my head. Those lifeless eyes staring into nothing, that mouth open in eternal terror. I quit soon after, transferred to another hospital, but sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, and for a split second, I swear I can smell it, that thick, putrid stench. I have this irrational fear that one day I'll find myself walking down that dim corridor again, the call light blinking from the corner of my eye. And when I do, I know he'll be waiting.
Story number 4.
The night shifts in the ER were always eerie, but tonight was different. The hospital felt alive, almost pulsing with something I couldn't name. We were short-handed too, so I was on my own for most of my rounds, moving through darkened hallways and dimly lit rooms. It was around 3 a.m. when it started. I just stepped into room 306, a place used mostly for overflow storage. Usually it sat empty, just a few boxes and an old hospital bed collecting dust. But tonight, as I stepped in, I saw someone lying in that bed. I froze. Heart pounding. This room wasn't supposed to have patients, but there she was, a woman with long, dark hair, her face turned toward the wall. She was completely still, her thin fingers clutching the sheets. I couldn't see her face, but the sight of her alone in that forgotten room sent a shiver down my spine. I took a shaky breath, telling myself it must have been an error, a patient transferred here by mistake. "Ma'am?" I whispered, my voice barely breaking the silence. She didn't move. I stepped closer, trying to catch a glimpse of her face. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Slowly, she turned her head toward me. The breath caught in my throat. Her eyes, they were wide open but empty, a hollow gray. Her face was pale, nearly translucent, with dark circles around her eyes as if she hadn't slept in years. Her mouth hung open slightly as if frozen mid-scream. I stumbled back, grabbing onto the doorframe for support. But she continued to stare at me, her mouth slowly curling into a twisted, lifeless smile. In a flash, I was out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding, and a cold sweat prickled my skin. I leaned against the wall, breathing hard, trying to process what I'd just seen. I told myself it was just a hallucination, the product of too many shifts and too little sleep. But when I turned back toward room 306, the door was slightly open again. I hadn't heard it creak, hadn't seen anyone else around. My hands shook as I edged closer. I leaned in, barely daring to look through the narrow crack in the door. The bed was empty. A chill ran down my spine. I blinked, sure I was seeing things. But no, she was gone. The bed perfectly made, not a wrinkle in the sheets. I spun around and hurried back toward the nurse's station, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. I found Jamie, another nurse, logging vitals into the computer. Did you see someone in room 306? I asked, my voice coming out in a strained whisper. She looked up at me, confused. 306? That room's been empty for years. They keep saying they'll repurpose it, but no one goes in there. I swallowed hard. I just saw someone in there, a woman, lying in the bed. Jamie stared at me for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Are you messing with me? Because if you are, it's not funny." "I'm not," I said, my voice shaking. "I swear she was there." She sighed, then stood up. "Let's go check. Maybe you saw something that looked like a person or, I don't know, a shadow or something." I hesitated but followed her back down the hallway. The door to room 306 was still cracked open, just as I'd left it. Jamie glanced at me, then pushed the door wide. Empty, just like I'd seen. The bed was there, untouched, not a single crease in the sheets. I felt my face flush. She was right there, Jamie, I insisted. I saw her. Jamie's expression softened a bit. Look, we're all a little sleep deprived. The brain plays tricks on us sometimes, you know? I wanted to argue, but there was nothing left to say. She patted me on the shoulder and left, and I stood there in the doorway, staring into the empty room. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small, dark stain on the floor, right by the bed. I crouched down, reaching out to touch it before I thought better of it. It was dried blood, faint but unmistakable. Goosebumps rose along my arms. No one had mentioned any accidents or injuries here, but the stain was old, too old to have come from anyone recently. I didn't go back to room 306 the rest of the shift, trying to focus on the patients that were very much alive. But as the night dragged on, I kept feeling her, watching me from somewhere just out of sight. No matter where I went, I felt those hollow eyes on me. Around 5 a.m., when I was just starting to relax, the power flickered. The lights went out completely, leaving only the dim glow of emergency lights down the halls. In the silence, I heard a sound, a faint, dragging noise, like someone sliding their feet along the floor. My stomach twisted. I turned, peering down the dark hallway. There, at the end, just barely visible in the low light, was the figure from before. She was standing perfectly still, staring straight at me. Her mouth opened, and a low, rasping sound filled the hallway. A word, spoken in a voice like a gust of icy wind. Help. I stumbled back, barely managing to keep my footing. But I didn't take my eyes off her. She took a slow step toward me, her bare feet dragging along the floor, leaving faint smears of that same dark stain. Help? Me? She rasped again, her voice hollow, broken, like something from the depths of a nightmare. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She kept coming closer, her empty eyes fixed on me, her expression twisted with pain. When she was only a few feet away, she stopped, reaching out one trembling hand. Her fingers were thin, almost skeletal. Her skin stretched taut over the bone. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. Please, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she faded, dissolving into the darkness. The lights flickered back on, flooding the hallway with brightness. I blinked, disoriented, but when I looked down, I saw a single footprint on the floor, smeared with dried blood. I reported it the next morning, though I didn't tell them everything. I told them about the woman I'd seen, hoping someone else would confirm it. But my supervisor just gave me a strange look and said, there was a woman who died in that room years ago, but it was an accident. She was very sick. That was all she would say, and I haven't worked the night shift since. But even now, I'll catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see her empty, hollow eyes staring back at me, begging me for help I can't give. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
I was the newest nurse at Crescent Bay Hospital, and it didn't take long before I started hearing whispers about the place. The patients had their own stories, but the staff had more. Every floor had its ghosts. Every nurse had their own haunting. They told me to avoid room 207. It didn't have any patients. Officially, it was just for storage. But the others spoke in hushed tones about how it had been the mirror room, once a part of the hospital's old psychiatric wing. They said that strange things happened in there after midnight. I wasn't one for ghost stories, but there was something unsettling about the way they described it. They warned me, but that night I was in charge of evening rounds, and somehow I found myself standing outside room 207, hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I shouldn't have opened it. The air inside was stale and icy cold, even though the rest of the hospital was warm. The single light above flickered, casting a faint glow over the room. Old mirrors lined the walls, some cracked and coated with dust, others strangely clean, gleaming in the dim light. They were arranged in a semicircle around the room, giving the space a warped, almost dizzying feel. As I stepped inside, my own reflection stared back at me from every angle, fractured and strange. But something didn't look right. In one of the mirrors, I looked different. My reflection was smiling, just barely, a small, unsettling twist of the lips that didn't match my face. A chill ran through me. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake the feeling that the mirrors were watching me, not the other way around. Then I heard it, a soft, whispering sound, faint at first, like distant murmurs. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, seeing nothing but my own face staring back at me from every angle. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a droning hum, like dozens of voices overlapping, saying something just out of reach. I forced myself to take a step back, but just as I did, something caught my eye. One of the mirrors was fogging up as though someone were breathing on it. I watched, frozen, as words began to form in the condensation. Help me. My stomach dropped. I took a step forward, heart racing as I looked closer. As I did, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single chilling voice, soft, pleading, coming from just behind me. Help me. I spun around, but no one was there, only my own reflection, staring back at me from the mirrors, looking as terrified as I felt. Please, the voice whispered again, and this time I saw her. She was in the mirror, standing just behind me. A woman with long, dark hair, her face pale, hollow eyes wide with fear. She reached out, pressing a ghostly hand against the glass, her fingers leaving a faint print on the mirror's surface. Help me, she said again, her voice broken, desperate. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I tried to escape. But no matter where I looked, she was there, in every mirror, following my every movement, her eyes pleading with me, reaching out as if she could somehow pull herself free. My heart was racing, my breaths coming fast and shallow. I tried to tear my gaze away, but something held me there, like I was trapped, rooted to the spot. You can't leave, she whispered, her voice a shuddering breath that echoed around the room. Panic surged through me. I turned, bolting for the door, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handle, throwing my shoulder against it, but it was like something was holding it shut from the other side. I pounded on it, screaming for help, my voice ringing hollow in the empty room. When I looked back, she was closer, her face pressed against the glass, back her hollow eyes staring into mine. Please, don't leave me here, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I felt tears pricking at my eyes, my entire body shaking as I backed away from the door. The mirrors seemed to close in, the woman's figure filling each one, her face multiplying until I was surrounded, her image pressing in on me from every angle. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the lights went out. I was plunged into darkness, the air thick with silence. My own breathing sounded deafening in the stillness. I stood there, paralyzed, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't see a thing. I reached out, fumbling for the door, feeling my way along the wall when something cold brushed against my hand. I jerked back, heart racing as I felt the touch again, this time a firm, icy grip on my wrist. I yanked my arm away, but the hold was relentless, pulling me back toward the center of the room. And then, the lights flickered back on. I was staring into the mirror, but it wasn't my face staring back. It was hers, her wide, hollow eyes, her mouth twisted into that same pleading smile. I stumbled back, but no matter where I moved, she followed, her image locked to mine, like a twisted reflection. Let me out, she whispered, and this time her voice was right behind me, cold breath brushing the back of my neck. I bolted for the door, praying it would open this time. I grabbed the handle, throwing my weight against it, and suddenly it gave way, sending me stumbling out into the hallway. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart pounding as I backed away. When I looked up, my reflection was still there, staring at me from the mirror mounted on the door, her hollow eyes meeting mine with that same twisted smile. I ran, not stopping until I was back at the nurse's station, breathless and shaking. I tried to tell my coworkers what had happened, but they just gave me strange looks, telling me I needed rest, that I was letting the stories get to me. But I knew what I'd seen. I avoided room 207 after that. But every now and then, as I walked the halls late at night, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a flash of dark hair, a pale face, hollow eyes watching me from a reflection, waiting, pleading for me to return. And sometimes I swear I can still hear her whisper.
Story number 6.
Most nights in the maternity ward are quiet. Babies sleep, mothers rest, and there's a calming hum to the whole place. But that night, the night I'll never forget, was different. I was covering a double shift, my feet already aching from walking the hospital floors. Around 2 a.m., the maternity wing was empty. No babies due, no mothers in labor, just me and the quiet. Or so I thought. I was going through paperwork when I heard it. The faintest sound of a lullaby drifting down the hallway. At first, I assumed it was just one of the lullaby machines malfunctioning. Sometimes they'd go off on their own, playing soft, comforting tunes. But the sound was coming from room 17, the farthest room at the end of the hall. My skin prickled. Room 17 had been empty for months. It was due for renovations and wasn't assigned to any patients. I walked down the hall, the lullaby growing louder with each step. The song was old-fashioned, almost like a lullaby from another time, a melody that seemed somehow familiar yet completely out of place. I reached the door, heart pounding, and hesitated. I had to remind myself it was just an empty room. But as I pushed open the door, the melody stopped abruptly like it had been cut off. The room was dark, except for a sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. The crib was there, just as it had been left by the previous staff, with a small tattered blanket draped over the side. Everything seemed still except for a strange chill in the air. I could feel a presence, something heavy and cold that made me want to turn around and run. And then I saw it. In the crib, a small figure no larger than a baby, wrapped in shadow, lay unmoving. Its outline was barely visible, but I could make out tiny hands curled tightly against its chest. My heart felt like it had stopped. My breath shallow as I took a step back, instinctively reaching for the light switch. I flicked the switch, but nothing happened. The lights refused to come on, leaving me standing in the darkness with that crib and the thing lying within it. I told myself it was my imagination, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But just as I turned to leave, I heard a whisper, a child's soft cry, a muffled whimper, as if it were coming from right beside me. "Please," a voice whispered, so faint it was barely audible. I froze, trying to understand if I'd really heard it, or if it was just my nerves. I tried to steady my breath, whispering to myself, "It's just an empty room. It's just an empty room." But as I turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hall. They were light, soft, almost like the padding of bare feet. I stepped out, looking down the corridor, expecting to see another nurse. But the hall was empty, the lights flickering as the footsteps grew closer, then stopped right in front of me. I stood there, rooted to the spot, waiting, listening. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the lullaby started again, softer this time, as if someone were singing it from far away. I backed up, unable to tear my gaze from the end of the hallway, and turned to hurry back to the nurse's station. But just as I was about to round the corner, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window at the far end of the hall, a woman in a hospital gown holding a bundle in her arms. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and sunken, staring straight at me through the glass. "Can you help me?" Her voice was a breath, a cold whisper that seemed to slide down the hall. The bundle in her arms shifted, as though something inside were moving, wriggling to break free. I stepped back, pressing myself against the wall, trying to keep my breathing steady. But the woman moved toward me, her gown billowing slightly, her feet gliding across the floor without touching it. The closer she came, the stronger the chill, until I could barely feel my fingers gripping the clipboard in my hands. "Please," her voice echoed in the empty corridor. "I just need someone to hold him." My mouth was dry, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only watch as she approached, her hollow eyes fixed on mine. Her arms extended toward me, revealing the small bundle wrapped in a faded blue blanket. And then, as she held it out, the blanket shifted, revealing a tiny, gray face, lifeless eyes staring blankly up at me. My legs finally kicked in, and I stumbled back, tripping and scrambling down the hallway, not daring to look behind me. I burst into the nurse's station, breathing hard, and looked around, hoping to see anyone else, any sign that I wasn't alone. But the ward was empty, silent. I told myself I had to be dreaming, that the lack of sleep was playing tricks on me. But as I glanced down, I realized I was still holding the blue blanket, the same one I'd seen wrapped around that ghostly bundle. I dropped it instantly, heart racing as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The blanket lay there on the floor, unmoving, ordinary, and yet utterly wrong. I reached out, touched it, half expecting it to dissolve into nothing, but it was real as I was standing there, shaken and terrified. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran down to the supervisor's office, demanding to be reassigned, begging for someone else to cover the maternity ward. They granted my request, sensing the desperation in my voice. I never went back to that ward, never stepped foot near room 17 again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that lullaby. It echoes in my dreams, a haunting melody that fills me with dread. And when I wake up, I can still feel the weight of that blanket in my hands, the cold chill of her touch lingering like a scar. I'll never know who or what I saw that night in room 17. But I'm sure of one thing, I wasn't alone in that ward. And whatever was there, it's still waiting. Story the end.
Story number 7.
Working nights in the ICU, you learn quickly that some patients linger between life and death longer than others. And then there are those who never leave at all. This is the story of Bed 13, a spot every nurse in our hospital dreaded. If you don't believe in ghosts, maybe this will change your mind. My first night on duty in the ICU was quiet. I was shadowing Linda, a seasoned nurse who'd been there for over 20 years. As we did rounds, she pointed out bed 13 with a hesitant look in her eyes. "Stay alert if you're assigned here," she warned. "Bed 13, it's cursed." I laughed, thinking she was trying to mess with me, a rookie on her first shift. But Linda's face was stone-cold serious. "Something's wrong in that bed," she said quietly. "You'll see." My second shift came 2 nights later, and I was on my own. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the patient call light blinked from bed 13. I walked over, and there lay Mr. Harris, a frail man in his 70s, hooked up to monitors and an oxygen mask, eyes half closed. "Are you all right, Mr. Harris?" I whispered. His eyelids fluttered open. I expected the dull stare of a sedated man, but instead his gaze was piercing, terrified. His lips parted, and he whispered, "He's here, standing right behind you." A cold shiver raced down my spine. I turned, half expecting to see someone in the room, but there was only the empty darkness and the soft beeping of machines. "Who's here, Mr. Harris?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The man," he whispered, voice thin and dry. "He comes to every person who dies here. He never leaves." I tried to reassure him, telling him it was just a dream, but his hand reached out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "He stands at the foot of my bed," he gasped, his voice hoarse with fear. "Watching, waiting." I stayed with Mr. Harris until he finally fell asleep, his breathing shallow and labored. It was nearly dawn when I left his room, and I tried to push his words out of my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling of something lurking in the ICU, something cold and heavy that seemed to watch from the shadows. The next night, I was on shift again, and I didn't see Mr. Harris. I found Linda, who told me with a grim look that he'd passed away early that morning. A chill washed over me as I remembered his warning about the man watching him in his last moments. Later that night, the call light in bed 13 went off. My stomach twisted as I glanced at the empty bed. There shouldn't have been any call for that room. It was empty. Nervously, I walked over, half expecting to see someone lying there. The room was dark, save for the eerie glow of the call light. I checked the button, thinking maybe it was a glitch. But as I reached down, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if someone were watching me. I looked around, but the room was empty. Just as I was about to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the glass cabinet across the room. It was faint, but I saw the outline of a figure, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes standing at the foot of bed 13. He was watching me, unmoving, a dark figure blending with the shadows. My heart pounded as I whipped around, but there was no one there. The bed was empty. The room was silent. I closed my eyes, took a shaky breath, and quickly exited, trying to convince myself I was just tired, imagining things. The next night, the same thing happened. The call light for bed 13 blinked on, even though it was unoccupied. But this time, when I entered the room, I felt an icy coldness grip me. The air seemed heavier, and I could swear I heard the faint sound of breathing, a slow, rhythmic rasp that didn't belong to anyone. I was frozen, standing just inside the door, when I felt a prickling on the back of my neck like someone was right behind me. Slowly, I turned, and there, at the foot of bed 13, stood the figure again. He was clearer this time, a gaunt, pale man with sunken eyes and a thin-lipped smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. His gaze bore into me, unblinking, like he could see right through me. His lips moved as if whispering something, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. His gaze seemed to hold me there, and as I stared back, I could feel a creeping dread filling me, pulling me down like quicksand. The figure reached out a bony hand, and I felt a coldness settle over my chest, as though he were pressing down on me. Finally, I broke free, stumbled back out of the room, and shut the door behind me. I stood there, catching my breath, heart racing. I was shaking, unable to believe what I'd just seen. When I finally told Linda, she nodded slowly, her expression haunted. "He's been here as long as I have. Some say he was a patient, others say he's a shadow of everyone who's ever passed in bed 13. But every nurse who's worked here long enough has seen him." Over the years, I heard more stories. Patients in bed 13 would talk about a man watching them, standing at the end of their bed, always just beyond reach. Some described him perfectly, without ever hearing about him from anyone else. And every time he appeared, the patient would pass within days. I started avoiding bed 13 whenever I could, trading shifts, requesting reassignments. But sometimes when I was alone at night, I would still see that call light blink on. And each time it did, I knew he was there, waiting, watching. They say every hospital has its ghosts, but in our ICU, Bed 13 wasn't just haunted. It was a doorway, a place where something old and twisted waited for the dying. I don't work there anymore, but I still have nightmares about those nights, about the man with hollow eyes and that thin-lipped smile. And sometimes when I wake up, I still feel him watching me. Story, the end.